What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello, and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that is obsessed with raising standards. I'm guest host Matthew O'Neill, and in each episode of the podcast, we're joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, and presidents, and perhaps one day even a UN Secretary General. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discover everything from industry innovation to struggles with immigration, and of course, the successes that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course, current co-chair of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Monica Whalley, CEO at Human One. Monica, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So it's been a year or so since Human One appeared in the Parliamentary Review. What have you and the firm been up to in the ensuing months?
Well, in the last 12 months, we've experienced considerable growth, despite the challenges that we're finding with regard to resourcing suitable candidates. I think that's been the most challenging element of our business. But despite this, we have worked very hard and recruited resources who concentrate almost solely on finding reliable and long-term candidates. So I think that we've met those challenges well. Obviously, I would love to have a further resource because we are most definitely in a candidate-driven market at the moment. And it makes it very difficult for us to find sufficient numbers for the demands of our clients. So whilst we've had a good year of growth, it's certainly been challenging in terms of finding sufficient numbers to satisfy our clients' needs.
Excellent. Well, why don't we take a bit of a detour before we continue talking about the present, and let's turn back the clocks to the past. So at the beginning, I know your business has adapted over the years, but can you tell me why the organization was formed originally? I believe it was in the late 80s, and how is it different today?
Well, I've been involved in this element or this area of recruitment from the very outset of my career, always in hospitality. The business has evolved in many different ways. When we originally started out, we were very heavily reliant on travellers from places like Australia, New Zealand, so Commonwealth countries where people would be taking a gap year. They'd come, they'd spend 3 to 6 months in the UK, and then they would head off to Europe and do their travels. And then we moved into various different nationalities, and that's the way the business has really evolved over the period that I've been involved in operating it. We've obviously had periods of challenge, but at no time do I think it's been quite as challenging as it is now. We're in a fortunate position because of our reputation and the length of time that I personally have been involved in recruitment. An enormous number of our candidates come via word of mouth. So that makes us fortunate in comparison to maybe some of our competitors. But even so, what we're finding is that the quality and the numbers are dropping quite considerably. And I think my biggest concern is if we were, for whatever reason, and because of the sector we're in, we're very heavily reliant on Eastern European labour, if for whatever reason we weren't able to continue resourcing from that area, I'm not actually quite sure where our next option would come from, because the challenges we have, and something we're doing is we're working with we're working with a charity called the Renaissance Foundation that is working with disadvantaged teenagers who have either grown up as carers or have come from homes which really haven't given them any guidance. So we are working towards trying to encourage young people from Britain, British-born nationals, but for whatever reason, our workforce historically, not just recently, has been very, very heavily reliant on either, as I said originally, people coming from Australia and New Zealand, and much more recently, Eastern European labour, because the people that are probably would be in our catchment in the UK do not want to do this type of work.
Well, what is the main reason that you think that is? You mentioned that attracting British workers is rather difficult. How could we change this?
Well, without meaning to sound too contentious, I think we need to look at the way that our system operates. I think that we make it way too easy for people to claim unemployment benefits. There are housing benefits, there are child benefits, there are all sorts of benefits that we could probably spend several minutes listing. So because of the way that our system works, we even have some of the foreign people that come to us after a period of time realize that they can utilize our very generous system. But I think, to answer your question directly, we are often looking at people who have come from third, fourth generation families where great-grandparents, grandparents, parents have never worked. So there is no work ethic, there is no discipline, whereas most of us grew up learning that we had to get up, we had to maybe do a paper round, well, that was in my day, have a Saturday job, go to school, study, because we wanted to set out on a career path. Unfortunately, I think there is a generation now where there is no role model teaching them that, regardless of the fact that they might be starting at a national minimum wage or a national living wage, there is the potential to work up through. Let's take a hotel, for example. Somebody could go in and begin work as a porter or a room attendant, and they may well be trained at national living wage. But if they show incentives and they're proactive and they're reliable, there is an opportunity for them to work right the way up through. And who knows, they could be the general managers and the managing directors of the future. But nobody seems to want to work hard enough. There does seem to be a mentality of, oh, I don't like this, or the work's too hard, so I'll give up after a week, or I'll give up after 2 weeks, and I'll go and find something else, which is less physical, which is less challenging. So that, for us, I would say, is the biggest. That, combined with the fact that we have a system which is exceptionally generous in terms of giving benefits to people, and more often than not, they are better off if they stay at home and don't work.
And is the solution in the future changing attitudes through education or awareness, or is just something that we're going to have to ride out?
I would like to think that the solution would be through education. This is something that we're working with quite closely with the charity that we support, the Renaissance Foundation. We were at award ceremony the other evening. We're members of the RET, which is the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. So we had a very, very interesting introduction from their CEO. And obviously, we're all aware that times are changing. They're changing probably more dramatically than we would ever have imagined. But they, as a group, who are very supportive of recruitment companies and their members. But one of the charities that they support is called the St. Giles Trust, which is a more evolved version of what we are doing. And they work with ex-convicts. Convict's a terrible word, but people who've come out of the prison system. And they are bringing people back into a working environment who thought that they would never, ever be able to work again because of their criminal background. And interestingly, in the past year, they have placed 1,000 people with criminal backgrounds into jobs, which I think is phenomenal. So I do think that education is the way forward. I think that onboarding people fully is also exceptionally important. Training people into a different mindset is very important, but it's not going to be easy.
Well, speaking of things that are not easy, I think we might need to touch on Brexit. Obviously, it has a significant impact on an industry that works primarily with migrants. What are the key challenges presented at the moment, and how are you navigating them?
One word, unsureness of the future. So we have a situation where we have encouraged all of our employees to apply for the long-term residency. I can't remember the exact wording. So a number of them have done this because they've been here for 5 years and longer. So that gives them some security. But what we're finding, and I don't necessarily think it's purely Brexit related. I think before Brexit became such a big issue, we were already finding that, for example, Romania is an enormous source. So we'll just use that country as an example. People will come to the UK with little English and little experience in any sector. Once they're here and they are hardworking on the whole and generally wish to have a better life, their English improves, their skill standard improves. They are then capable of commanding a higher hourly rate. So they're not necessarily leaving the UK. I know a large number have, but the ones that are really determined to be successful are moving into other sectors which pay better. So once they improve their skills, they may go to university and college and obtain a qualification.
Fabulous.
Their English is, as I say, better. They then move into a sector which pays better. Those that don't want to do that, we are finding are now moving to countries like Germany, Italy, where they're paid in euros. Therefore, they're not having to struggle with a volatile exchange rate. London, the standard of living is very high. Accommodation is high. Travel is high. So it's quite difficult for anybody to come here. We're not living in the times of Dick Whittington. The streets aren't paved with gold, even though they believe, or at one point did believe that was the case. The quality of life that they are experiencing, I think, is actually not as good as the quality of life that they would be having back home or in another European country. And that is not just Brexit related. So I think that Brexit is used slightly as a little bit of a scapegoat.
Right. So you think it's more of a catch-all for other underlying problems?
Absolutely.
Well,
I think if I could speak personally, I think that I probably, I spend a lot of time listening to LBC and I listen to different opinions, but I think Brexit is something that we need to draw a line under. We need a decision one way or another. And like everything, whatever happens, once everybody knows where they stand, then we can work with it. Right now, there's so much speculation. There are so many differing opinions. So it gives everybody an excuse to say, oh, well, I'm not sure, or I don't know. So it's a case of, it's something I've sort of always been taught. Worrying about something is always worse than the actual reality.
Well, if we could pivot for a moment, I know that you're a big believer in making sure that the market tips a little further in favor of the employee rather than the employer. So as in guaranteeing certain rights and standards, do you think that this is happening on the whole?
Definitely. I think that we've worked very hard with our clients over the last 3 years. And one thing I would say was that there was a period of time, and I think this is something that's evolved probably over a decade, where there was such an influx of cheap labour that clients treated people very, very badly. So it was a case of, well, this face doesn't fit, or this person isn't picking the job up quickly enough, so we will just replace them with somebody else. So for that period of time, it was a client-driven market. What we have done is we've worked very closely, and we've also been very specific about clients that we work with, and have actually stopped working with a number of clients who will only pay a national living wage. So the clients that we now have much higher pay rates with, which means that we are able to attract a much better caliber of individual. We also encourage the client to assess our people, even though they're our employees, but assess them to see whether they are eligible for promotion within the hotel or the gym or the nightclub or wherever it is that they might be working. So I think that we have a balance now between ensuring that the candidate, stroke employee, is well looked after. And we formed an organisation called Leaders of Industry about 18 months ago, where we have regular meetings and we will discuss issues such as corporate social responsibility. We'll discuss Brexit was the most recent meeting that we have. We'll discuss security issues which arise within hotels. So it's an open forum where our clients from various departments within the properties that we work with can voice their concerns, and we then go away and we endeavour to work with them to improve on weak areas in order that we can improve the working environment for potential candidates coming into the industry.
Well, it sounds like you do go quite the extra mile, and I know that you go the extra mile for your staff to create an atmosphere that keeps them happy and drawn to the industry. How do you achieve this?
How do we achieve the staff, did you say?
Well, I know that you go the extra mile to create an atmosphere that keeps them happy. How do you do this?
Well, we have a dedicated head office team. We take part in many webinars. I think I already said we work very closely with the REC. If we have any concerns, we will consult them and ask their advice on how best we can handle difficult situations, and whether that's a change in statutory law or otherwise. We reward our staff well. I mean, silly little things. We'll have a day where we'll take them boxes of cookies in or cupcakes. So we recognise them, and we recognise the small achievements that they make. I mean, without wanting to sound or use a cliche, I think we really show them that we care and that they matter. And something that the CEO of the REC mentioned the other evening was that we have to change the mindset. We're working with people. People have, obviously, we're all complex. We all are very different in how we handle situations. So we're not buying a commodity like a box of paper clips. We are working with people who have good days, who have bad days, who have all sorts of challenges, whether those be financial, whether they be familial. So we try to take time to spend with each and every one of our employees to listen to any issues that they might have, and we will then share those with the client in order that we can all work together. Because as far as we're concerned, retention and reliability are what are going to increase profitability and also save on client budgets in the long term. Because if we keep changing staff, obviously there's a huge cost in that, because they have to be trained. They can't work at the same level as somebody who's been there for 6 months or 12 months. So, and one of the things that we're trying to do is work with the staff to ensure that we retain and also encourage them to be reliable and take what they do seriously, rather than walk away if they have a tough day.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of changing mindsets in this, but I'm sure there's still quite a lot of misconceptions out there about your industry. What are the biggest misconceptions about your industry, and what can be done to address them?
Well, I think the misconceptions are, and again, this is something that has evolved over a period of time. I'm hoping that we're moving away from them, but I do think that there has been an historic perception of exploitation. There were a number of hotel operators who were paying individuals by, let's say if they were a room attendant, they were paying by the room rather than an hourly rate, which meant that people were more often than not being paid below the national living wage. And I think there was a documentary not so long ago about that. Well, I say not so long ago, it's probably a couple of years ago. So I do think that there is still an underlying perception that there is exploitation, and there may well still be at certain levels. I think potentially at sort of the lower range, they were talking 3-star hotels down to bed and breakfast. That may well still happen. But so there is that. I also think that there has been an element of trafficking of vulnerable individuals to the UK, where, and I'm not talking about countries further afield, I'm talking about from Eastern Europe, where there have been recruitment companies who have worked alongside, and I've heard stories about both Bulgaria and Romania, where they will pay a fee, often of several £1,000s, having been promised that they will receive work when they arrive in London. And of course they arrive and there is no work and there is no accommodation, which means that we now see so many people on the streets. And something just on a personal level, I worked with Crisis at Christmas over the Christmas period last year, and I was amazed because I would say that 75% of the people that we were looking after in the universities and colleges, which very kindly opened their doors, I would say that the largest number were men who had come from Hungary, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, and had just nowhere to go.
Well, it is a very troubling trend. We're almost out of time, but before we do go, Is there any particular project that stands out as a success in your mind?
Any particular
project that you've been involved with?
Project, sorry. That stands out in my mind in terms of how we can improve things, or in terms of, I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
As a success in your mind, is there any real projects that you feel are especially noteworthy?
Well, I think that there are 2 or 3 things that spring to mind. I think the fact that we've managed to increase our hourly pay rates to well above even the London living wage with a number of our clients has really helped us. I think our leaders of industry events really help us because it's a forum where everybody can speak frankly about the challenges that they're facing. I think that working with a charity like the Renaissance Foundation is a project that we feel passionately about. We've already introduced several groups of young people into hotels and given them experience working in various different departments. So I think those 3 projects would be the ones that I would say have really improved our own awareness and that of our clients as to the challenge that we all face.
Well, currently the challenge that we're facing is that we're unfortunately out of time. I do hope that we can continue this conversation at some point in the near future. I would very much like to thank Monica for coming on board the podcast today. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Matthew.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Monica Whalley, especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Human One are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is host Jonathan White's interview with the Parliamentary Review's co-chair, Lord Pickles. Lord Pickles was Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government under David Cameron, before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the UK's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist or flag enthusiast to you and I. I hope you all enjoy listening. Back to Jonathan.
Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Withdrawal Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without wrecking amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December. Something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition who claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments that introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshirean, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament, because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well, I was used
to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to us. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Blunkett was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives had never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realise that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastic new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state. And it was on the basis of tough love. It was on the basis of getting people into jobs. It was about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continued as the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech that we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress it. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old males cycling to evensong and warband. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we're not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you're also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that, and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country.
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament, with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens, and we do know that that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, 7 years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy because the former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you were quite unscathed from it.
It was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of time, but I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle. Those have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know there's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to stand beneath the currently silent Elizabeth Tower, hot toddy in hand, contemplating our mission to keep raising those standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.